Now we're going to go ahead and talk about the grid. The grid is a very important tool when you're planning your designs. Lots of things are designed to grids. If you think about city blocks, interior spaces, building exteriors, and of course books, and even more recently websites. Why is this formal arrangement of lines so comfortable to us? What makes horizontals and verticals work for a huge range of applications? Think about it. Why are they everywhere? Well, you can think of a grid as a plan. It's a plan for your layout. Many of the pages that you see every day have a grid. You may not see it, but it is there. It's holding up the design, establishing structure, guiding the page elements. A grid is basically a set of guidelines. It's visible in the design process and invisible to the end user or audience. It's used for aligning and repeating elements on a page. A page layout may or may not stay within the grid lines, depending on how much repetition or variety the design style in the series calls for. Grids are meant to be flexible. Using a grid to lay out elements on the page may require just as much or more graphic design skill than which was required to the design without the grid. A grid is an invisible structure. It's used to guide the placement of elements on your page. Grids don't appear on the printed pieces, but their influence may be evident in the widths of the column texts, the uniformity of space around photographs, or the consistent placement of repeating elements from page to page in a magazine, for instance. They are basically a series of guidelines that determine the margins of the piece, the space between page elements, the headlines, the body text, the photographs, etc., and it lets you know where to put things on a blank page. Grid systems bring visual structure and balance to a layout. As a tool, grids are useful for organizing and presenting information. When used properly, they can enhance the user experience by creating predictable patterns for users to follow. From a designer's point of view, they allow for an organized method for planning systematic layouts. After creating a well-structured and usable grid, consider allowing it to breathe. A page without a grid is a usable nightmare. On the other hand, a grid that has creatively overlapping, escaping, or energizing columns leads to a more enjoyable user experience. Discovering or planning areas of the design that will have some freedom and will lead to more interesting and appealing design solutions is all part of the process. Let's take a look at the anatomy of a grid because there's some terms that I want you to be familiar with. Before deciding when and why and how to use grid, you need to know the elements of the grid and how to create it. While it is invisible in the final printed piece, you need to be able to see it during the page construction. In your page layout, you've probably set some margins. These margins often show up as a light solid or dashed lines on the screen. These top, bottom, left, and right margins create a box in the middle of your page. Stop there and you have a single unit grid. If you further divide the page into uniform parts, then you've created a multiple unit grid. You can create a visible grid to aid in page layout using the guideline features of your page layout software or by drawing lines or boxes that you place in a non-printing layer of your publication. Often you can pull a guideline from the rulers on the side of the page and place them where you want them to be. Some of the terms I want you to be familiar with are margins and grids. So here's our margins, and the grid units are these gray boxes right here. Margins basically are going to define the outside boundary of your page. This is basically negative space between the format and the content, which surround and define the live area where type and images are going to be arranged. They frame the content of your pages. Margins may not be equal all around. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, but they're normally consistent from page to page or panel to panel. In most programs, you would set the margins when you define the page dimensions, the format dimensions. You can also adjust the margins on the fly by moving the guides on the screen in certain applications. The proportions of margins bear a great deal of considerations as they help establish the overall tension within the composition. Margins can be used to focus attention, serve as a resting place for the eye, or act as an area for subordinate information. Alleys and grids. Okay, so down here we have our alleys, and of course here are the grids. So when you divide interior space of your page into uniform parts, the white space between the units are the alleys. Depending on how you've set up the grid, the alleys may run horizontally or vertically or in both directions on your page. In some designs, this would translate to the white space or gutter between a column of text. Gutters. In a two-page or two-panel spread, as shown here, the gutter is basically the inside margin. It's the space on either side of the fold. In some page layout programs, the space between two columns of text is sometimes called the gutter as well. And then finally, the grid units. The grid units are the primary locations on your page where you will place all the text and images. They determine placement, not necessarily size. That is, if you have a graphic image that is larger than your grid unit, it doesn't mean that you can't use it. You would use your grid units to help resize the photograph, ideally to fill 1, 2, 3, or more grid units, and then to place that image on your page. Here's another example of a grid, and we have some more anatomy that we're going to look at here. So if I mouse over, you can see the various components that we're going to be talking about. The first one we're going to talk about is the columns, and it's outlined in green right here. The columns are vertical alignments of type that create the horizontal divisions between the margins. There can be a number of columns. Sometimes they are all the same width, and sometimes they are different widths that correspond to specific information. This red stroked box is referred to as a module, and modules are basically the individual units of space. They're separated by regular intervals, which, when repeated across the format, create columns and rows. These blue lines indicate the flow lines right here. Flow lines are alignments that break the space into horizontal bands. Flow lines help guide the eye across the format and can be used to impose additional stopping and starting points for text or images. Spatial zones. This gray box indicates a spatial zone. Spatial zones are groups of modules that together form a distinct field. Each field can be assigned a specific image or text for displaying information. For example, a long horizontal field might be reserved for images, and the field below it might be reserved for a series of text columns. And then markers. Markers are placement indicators for subordinate information, and it allows them to consistently appear. These would indicate things like running heads or section titles, folios, which are basically page numbers, or any other element that occupies only one location in a page layout. Grids provide visual organization. Grids have different uses, and they may not be appropriate for all situations or all designers. Publications such as magazines and newsletters almost always require a grid. It provides page-to-page continuity. It also helps speed production because the designer doesn't have to start from scratch, laying out and designing each page of the publication. In a series of single but related pieces, such as a series of posters or information sheets or a single campaign or a single product line, a common grid can help unify and separate pieces. In a single piece that has many elements that are separate, blocks of text, headlines, photographs, drawings, a grid can help to organize those elements on the page. So here we see an example of a bridal magazine, and you can see that even though the images and the text blocks are different sizes and they sit in different locations, they all follow a unifying grid. This magazine is basically, each page is divided into a 3-column grid, even though on some of the pages the text is, maybe shown in 2 columns, or the picture might span all 3 columns, or maybe it's 1-column text, but you can kind of see the underlying structure of the grid as you look at these various images shown here. Let's go ahead and let's talk about some different types of grids that you might encounter. So this is an example of a manuscript grid. This is also called a block grid, and it's structurally the simplest kind of grid. As its name implies, its base structure is a large rectangular area that takes up most of the page. Its job is to accommodate extensive continuous text like a book or a long essay. To add visual interest, you can experiment with adjusting the margins. As a general rule, wider margins help focus the eye and create a sense of calm or stability. Narrow lateral margins increase tension because live matter is in closer proximity to the format edge. Traditional manuscript grids use margins that are symmetrical in width. It's just as acceptable, though, to create an asymmetrical structure, wherein the margin intervals are different. An asymmetrical structure introduces more white space for the eye to use as an area of rest. It may also provide a space for notes, spot illustrations, or other editorial features that don't occur regularly and therefore don't really warrant the articulation of a true column. And here I have some examples of some media that is just using the manuscript grid. So these are mostly books or publications with long bodies of text. The next grid that we want to look at is the column grid. The column grid is a place where you can show information that is discontinuous, and it benefits from being organized into an arrangement of vertical columns. Because columns can be dependent on each other for running text, independent for small blocks of text, or crossed over to make wider columns, the column grid is very flexible and can be used to separate different kinds of information. For example, some columns may be reserved for running text and large images, while captions may be placed in an adjacent column. This arrangement clearly separates the captions from the primary material, but it also allows the designer the ability to create a direct relationship between the captions and the primary material. In a traditional column grid, the gutter between the column is a measure of x, and the margins are usually assigned a width of twice the gutter measurement, or 2x. Margins that are wider than the column gutters focus the eye inward, easing tension between the column edge and the edge of the format. There are no rules, though, and these things can always be changed. Designers are definitely free to adjust the column to margin ratio to suit their taste or their intentions. In a column grid, there's also a subordinate structure, and these are flow lines, vertical intervals that allow the designer to accommodate unusual breaks in text or images on the page, and they create horizontal bands across the format. And here's two examples of two different types of column grids, and here I have some examples of some format that are using two column grids. So over here we have our two column grid. This one is using two column grid. You can see though how this pull quote spans across both grid lines. And here's another example of a two column grid. The next grid that we're going to look at is the modular grid. The modular grid is it's used for extremely complex projects, and it requires a degree of control beyond what a column grid will provide. In this situation, a modular grid is the most useful choice. A modular grid is essentially a column grid with a large number of horizontal flow lines that subdivide the columns into rows. This creates a matrix of cells called modules. Each module defines a small chunk of information or informational space, and if they're grouped together, these modules define areas called spatial zones to which specific roles may be assigned. Modular grids are often used to coordinate extensive publication systems. They also lend themselves to the design of tabular information like charts, forms, schedules, or navigation systems. Modular grids were very popular during the 1950s to the 1980s, and they are somewhat associated with ideal social or political order. These have roots in the rationalist thinking of the Bauhaus and Swiss international styles, which celebrated objectivity and order reduction, bringing everything down to the essentials, a real clarity of form and communication. Even projects with simple informational needs or single formats can be structured with a modular grid, adding additional meaning or order, clarity and thoughtfulness, or an urban mathematical or technical or technological feel to them. So all of these things can be implemented from using modular grids. And here I have some examples of things that are using modular grids in different ways. So here you can see that the modular grid is very apparent in these rounded rectangles, and some of them span multiple of the columns that are created by the modular grids, creating a spatial zone, and everything's kind of blocked off. The next example is this one right here, which also uses modular grids, and you can see how the information, even though it's not quite as apparent as the last example, it does have some horizontal breaks with the headers and whatnot. Here's another one, and this one uses text really creatively because the text is not all orientated going the same direction. Some of the modules actually pop right out at you. And then here's the last example. Lots of times magazines use modular grids, and you can see in the table of contents it's pretty apparent, and also in this picture layout right here, all of the pictures are spanning multiple modules in the grid. The next grid that we're going to look at is a hierarchical grid. Sometimes the visual and informational needs of a project require an odd grid that doesn't fit into any category. These grids conform to the needs of the information they organize, but they're somewhat based on intuitive placement of alignments, customized to the various proportions of the elements. Column widths, as well as the intervals between them, tend to vary in these types of grids. Web pages are great examples of hierarchical grids. Because of the nature of a website and how the user's settings and browser windows can vary, they require a flexible width and depth that precludes a strict modular approach, but it still requires some sort of standardization or templating of alignments and display areas. So here's another example of a hierarchical grid that could be used on a website. This kind of grid, whether used to build books, posters, or web pages, is almost an organic approach to the way information and elements are ordered and still holds all the parts together architecturally in a typographic space. So I have some examples of these sorts of grids, and these are all taken from different websites, and you can see how they differ quite a bit depending on the information that is displayed. Sometimes you're going to want to tie elements of a page design together by utilizing grids. For the most part, people prefer organized visual information. Newsletters, magazines, brochures, annual reports, and books often have many visual elements, columns of text, headlines, photos, illustrations, pull quotes, etc. Grids allow the designer to build page-to-page consistency in these documents. Readers expect to find page numbers in the same location on each page. When all the text in a given article, even when it spans several pages, has a consistent look, including column width, it enhances readability. Readers often expect to find sidebars, informational text, and other often repeated elements in the same place from page to page. A grid used consistently on all pages of a multi-page document makes it easier for the designer to provide the consistent look that the reader often expects. A carefully conceived grid system also allows the designer to introduce variations without forsaking readability or consistency. It also speeds up layout because it takes the guesswork and let's look back and see what we did before out of the equation. You know where to place elements from one page to the next. Grids can definitely unify a series of dissimilar documents. There are many ways to establish visual unity throughout a series of related pieces. You may use your logo on top of all your marketing pieces, or you may have color-coded brochures for different aspects of your business. Grids are another way to bring unity and cohesiveness to a collection of brochures, sales sheets, display ads, spec ads, and other elements of your marketing arsenal. In a series of single but related pieces, such as a series of posters or information sheets as shown here for a single ad campaign or a single product line, a common grid can help unify and separate pieces. Let your grid help you place repeating elements in the same place from piece to piece. Let your grid provide a consistent guide for mixing graphics and text. The informational sheets shown here have a common style for the headline treatments, but they don't all use the same number or number of graphics or text on them. So this 2-unit grid helps to unify these pieces. This is a fairly simple and straightforward example, but I think it also is effective, and obviously these pieces all look somewhat related. That's somewhat due to the underlying grid. One grid, you can have many designs. Grids are sometimes accused of being static or boring, but it's not necessarily the fault of the grid. If used properly, grids can offer a variety of creative design options. Here we have a grid that shows a 4x6, a 24-unit grid system, and it takes on different lives using the same graphic images and varying amounts of text. So let's take a peek. This is all the same text and all the same images, but they are just placed in different locations and placed differently, mixing the format. And you can see that we have 4 distinct different types of layouts. So we go from 2-column text to maybe 1-column text, and here the text is in 4 columns. Here it's in 2 columns, but it's mixed a little bit. So all kinds of fun things that we can do utilizing the same underlying grid system, the same structure. I hope this gave you a little more clarification on grids and explained some of the ups and downs of using grids and why you would want to use grids in your work.